All right, welcome to the first of 8 classes with the John David Ebert School for the Study of Culture, Cosmology, and the Arts. We will be studying the philosophy, mythology, and cosmology of Rudolf Steiner in this course over 8 weeks. In this first class, what I want to do is just go over the basic details of Steiner's life. We'll look at the curriculum a bit, but first I want to go over the details of Steiner's life. So he was born in 1861. Let me get over to his Wikipedia page, which is useful. Here he is over here. And it's interesting with Steiner, he looks like a mystic. He looks like what he is. Germany has a long tradition of producing mystics alongside of their official mainstream philosophers. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas is the great scholastic philosopher, and alongside of him appears Meister Eckhart, the German mystic, who interiorizes all of Christianity. He's pretty amazing. And then, of course, we have Nicholas of Cusa, and Steiner has a book on mysticism at the dawn of the modern age where he goes over all these guys, Paracelsus, Jakob Boehme, and so forth. So Steiner comes out of that stream, except that he's a little different in that, whereas those individuals really represent the mystical stream in opposition to mainstream academic philosophy, Steiner embodies both because he comes out of the tradition of German idealism. He studied Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel very thoroughly and knew them very well. And indeed, his first book, maybe not exactly, technically the first book, because in 1886 he was working on Goethe, and he puts out The Theory of Knowledge Implicit in Goethe's Worldview while he's editing Goethe's archives. And so it's really his second book, 1894, Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path. It's also known as The Philosophy of Freedom. You won't find ideas about reincarnation and karma and mysticism in that book because I think he was still trying to write for an academic audience, even though he was always kind of an outsider to academe. He was kind of a peripatetic scholar who was haunting the cafes in Vienna. And he was very well known in the cafes as an expert on both Goethe and Nietzsche. Indeed, Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, asked him to edit Nietzsche's works. Well, Nietzsche was still alive at that point, and Steiner went in to see him. And he turned the offer down, not because Nietzsche was basically an atheist and a materialist, but because of political reasons regarding the individual whose name I've forgotten, who was in charge already of the Nietzsche archives. He didn't want to make trouble for that guy. So he's born in 1861. And in the area that is now known as Croatia, and he dies in 1925 in his 60s. And he had a rural upbringing in very poor village areas. His father was a railway technician, and he paid to have his son attend a technical school. His first experience with the paranormal was at the age of 7, when he was at the train station, and his mother's sister, whom he did not know, appeared to him as a ghost at the train station and asked him for help. He was a bit bewildered by this, but not long after that, he saw his father very distraught after reading a letter, and he realized that his aunt had committed suicide and that he had seen his aunt come to him. So that was his first sort of paranormal experience. But the next major experience was actually his discovery of geometry at about the age of 10. He found a geometry textbook which he liked because it created a world of intelligible forms that had nothing to do with the sensory world, that had nothing to do with the actual physical world. But he believed these shapes kind of must have existed in the same sort of dimension that the ghost of his aunt existed in, a sort of de-worlded realm of signifiers floating in a kind of metaphysical realm. The idea of a triangle is not the same thing as any particular physical triangle that manifests itself on the physical plane. The idea is there, and it is absolute and metaphysical. So he took right away to geometry, and he was mostly self-taught because in school classrooms, he was usually bored. Later on, when he discovered Immanuel Kant at the age of 16, he read the textbook for the classroom, so he was familiar with it, and then he stapled pages from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason into the textbook, And while the teacher was reading along because the teacher was lazy and didn't prepare lessons, he only read from the book, Steiner could pretend like he was reading the book, but he was actually trying to figure out Kant's Critique of Pure Reason at the age of 16. So he was mostly an autodidact. He was always ahead of his teachers, and he was doing very, very well. He eventually taught himself calculus, trigonometry and calculus and so forth. So he starts off with a very firm and solid grounding in the sciences. He enters a technical school for his education, so very strong grounding in mechanics and physics and the sciences. Very interesting for a mystic to be grounded in the physical world in such a concrete way as Steiner actually was. So then he gets a job editing Goethe's scientific writings. He is recommended by one of his teachers who was very impressed with him. And so he gets a job helping to organize Goethe's scientific writings, which at this point were not taken seriously. Steiner took them very seriously. And indeed, I have appended my lecture on Goethe's scientific worldview in this first class so that you can click on that and get a feel for the background that Steiner is coming from. The world of German idealist thinkers, Goethe, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. Those were formative thinkers for his intellect, which he then synthesizes with the esoteric traditions of the mystics, Jakob Böhme, the Rosicrucian worldview, alchemy, all of that sort of hidden implicit occult knowledge is then synthesized with German idealism. So he brings high German intellect into the realm of mysticism. So this guy is no New Age flake. This is a pretty heady man with a very high IQ. So he's working on Goethe for a while, and then eventually he writes his first book, as I say, The Philosophy of Freedom, or Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path, which is written more or less in the style of German idealism, no mysticism in it. And then in 1895, his next book, his third technically, he writes a book about Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, a fighter against his time. He was very impressed with Nietzsche and liked him quite a bit, despite Nietzsche's atheism and materialism. We have just finished a course on Friedrich Nietzsche, and one gets the sense that Nietzsche wasn't so much against spirituality as he was against the Christian version of it. He took great fun in dismantling Christianity and deconstructing it and pulling it apart. But I think of Nietzsche as an intensely spiritual man, fundamentally. Underneath all of that, I think he's fundamentally a spiritual man, and I think Steiner picked up on that aspect of him. So then he finally, he hooks up with the Theosophists, as one of them saw his talk on Goethe's wonderful fairy tale, the Beautiful Snake and the Green Lily. Steiner was giving a lecture on that, and one of the Theosophists saw it and thought that he would be great to join the Theosophists, or at least give a lecture to them. So in 1900, at the age of just about 40, he was 39, he gives his first theosophical talk at the Theosophical Library in Berlin. And the talk is actually on Nietzsche, who had just died in 1900. And then he gives one of his first lecture cycles, Mysticism at the Dawn of the Modern Age, as a kind of boundary act. So this is interesting because Theosophy has been founded by Madame Blavatsky, who at this point is dead, and it has been taken over by Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater, and they are in India, in Adyar. And the whole thing is based on major criticisms of Christianity, although they nominally say that all religions are equal. I'm not much for Theosophy, let me say this. I think that Steiner regarded it as a bunch of flakes and goofballs. He's very eloquent about that in his later lectures when he criticizes them, and that's the impression of them that I get as well. It's just mush. It's a kind of syncretism, a mush, smashing together all the religious traditions. It doesn't really work, but the emphasis was on Indian wisdom. That was the thing for them. So along comes Steiner, and they allow him tentatively to be the secretary of the Theosophical branch, the German branch of Theosophy. And it's a great opportunity for him because he knew he wasn't going to have a career in academe with his mystical beliefs. So now he has an audience that's open to hear ideas about the other world, reincarnation, karma, the afterlife, the existence of the soul, and so forth. But the fact is that when he gives this lecture cycle in 1900 on mysticism at the dawn of the modern age, it's all about Western mystics, starting with Meister Eckhart, and then he goes through Johannes Thaler, and then down through Jakob Böhme, and so forth. Paracelsus specifically emphasizing Western spiritual wisdom. So you can already see the seeds of the dissension that this isn't going to work. It lasts for about 12 years, and interestingly enough, it parallels the same period of time that Jung was under the influence of Freud. They both break in the same year, 1912-13. That's it for both Jung. With his influence of Freud, he has slain the father, as it were, by that point. And Steiner has done a similar thing in creating anthroposophy, which is not a term that he invented because it goes way back. I think Jakob Böhme used it at one point. It's a very old term. But he picks it up and calls it anthroposophy, the German branch. And this is over, indeed, once again, over them, Annie Besant and Charles Leadbetter emphasizing the Eastern aspect of this when he found this beautiful young boy, Jiddu Krishnamurti, walking on the beaches of India. Nowadays, we would call this individual a pedophile, and apparently he did have pedophilic tendencies, and that was part of the motivation here for promoting Krishnamurti as the reincarnation of Christ. He brought over Annie Besant. She checked him out and agreed with him. So this is going to be the reincarnation of Christ. And Steiner at this point is like, we're not doing that. The Christ being was the central being, the central event, the event of what he calls the mystery of Golgotha, which is the central event around which history revolves, which makes possible new spiritual possibilities. And Christ was a being, a sun god, who came down from the sun and took up residence in the body of Jesus of Nazareth at age 30 when he is baptized by John. And the descent of the dove is the descent of the Christ being into him, which gives him the powers to perform miracles for the 3 years of his ministry. And it was a one-time only event. And then when Christ is crucified, according to Steiner, when his blood leaks out and touches the earth, it transubstantiates the entire earth. Its aura is changed. He says if you could see it from outer space, looking at the earth, you would see its color, the color of its aura, its halo would change, making possible new spiritual possibilities. So he took the Christ being very seriously and was not a being who was ever going to reincarnate. So then he breaks with the Theosophical group, 1912 and 13. Meanwhile, he's written his masterpieces, and we'll examine some of these. The perhaps now, unfortunately, titled book Theosophy in 1904. 1904 was his big breakthrough year in astrology. For you people who know astrology, this is his Uranus opposite Uranus breakthrough at age 40, when he produces, here he's 41, 42, 43, Theosophy, which we'll be reading, How to Know Higher Worlds, which we'll also be reading, Cosmic Memory, that as well, and The Way of Initiation in 1904. Now, his magnum opus is the 1910 Outline of Occult Science, but I have a YouTube series on that going chapter by chapter. So for those who are curious, you can go through that. So I'm deliberately not duplicating the YouTube videos that I've done on various texts of Steiner's. We won't be duplicating any of those in this course. So he has the final break with the Theosophists in 1913 and sets up the first meeting of the Anthroposophical Society. And then on September 20th of that year, they lay the foundation stone in Switzerland at a place called Dornach for the Goetheanum. Now, the Goetheanum was indeed inspired by Wagner's Bayreuth. Steiner initially started out not liking Wagner at all, but he slowly came around to appreciating the maestro, and then decided that he wanted to write a series of mystery plays, and there are, I believe, 4 of them. And he starts writing the mystery plays in 1910, starting with the Portal of Initiation, a place for the performance of these plays. And so it was originally going to be, he tried Munich, they turned him down, Stuttgart turned him down, and he knew that that would be the case. But there was a doctor who was a fan of anthroposophy who owned land in Dornach, which he didn't know what to do with, and he donated it to Steiner, so they built the Goetheanum there. So the foundation stone is laid there in 1913. Then, meanwhile, the war breaks out in 1914, and it puts a damper on his lecturing. Chaos erupts all over the place. He's beginning to accrue enemies, the Nazis in particular. After World War I, will start spotting him and keeping an eye on him in the 1920s. But so he had a rough time, so he wrote the book The Riddle of Man in 1916, and in 1919, The Threefold Social Order, which after the war was over then in 1918, this was published in 1919, and it becomes a kind of European bestseller because he has this idea of reforming society based on thinking, feeling, and willing. Everything occurs in threes for Steiner. Thinking has to do with the head and the creative aspect of society, whereas feeling from the heart, let's say, has to do with the rhythmic system, the autonomic, involuntary rhythmic system of the circulation of the blood and the heart, whereas willing has to do with the metabolic system. And in the metabolic system, he also includes the limbs, the arms, the motors of action, which carry out willing. So he thought that society could be organized on this threefold order, the economy corresponding to the metabolic limb system, and the sort of middle classes corresponding to the circulatory system. But that, of course, never realized, but people liked the idea. And after World War I, he starts to become a bit pragmatic in the sense that now he begins to apply his ideas and his knowledge of the spiritual worlds to the physical world. People start asking him about education, and so the first Waldorf school opens in Stuttgart in 1919, which is based on educating the child. And he has a theory that every 7 years there's a fundamental transformation in our subtle body. The subtle body for Steiner is composed of 4 components in one model, 7 in another, 9 in the final model. But in one model, it's body, soul, and spirit. So we have the threefold. But the body is composed of the physical body, which we share in common with rocks and minerals. But the physical body is animated by what he calls an etheric body, which is what we have in common with plants. And it's a sort of deep, dreamless sleep consciousness that plants have that in us organizes our physical body. Then there's an astral body, which we share in common with animals. Plants don't have this. Astral body confers a waking consciousness with a nervous system on an entity. It opens up a world spread out in space and time. And so passions and desires also are rooted in the astral body, the sex drive and the power drive and so forth. What might be termed the lower chakras in Kundalini Yoga, those are all part of the astral body. And then we have the ego. Human beings have something that animals don't have, which is the ego, the I, which is self-reflexive awareness and the ability to think. And it, too, is broken down into 3 components. The sentient soul, which is the soul that animates our senses. The intellectual soul, which is exactly what it sounds like, the ability to think abstractly. And the consciousness soul, which sort of brings the intellectual soul in conjunction with the imagination. And that, he believed, that was the task of Western civilization since the Renaissance, was to develop the consciousness soul by including within it what Jean Gebser calls the mythical consciousness structure, or what Steiner calls the imagination, the imaginative part of the soul, in conjunction with the mental consciousness structure that has been built up by means of the West's understanding of the ego and its very stable way of apprehending the outer world. That's the task of the consciousness soul for Faustian civilization. All right, so let's see here. He has, in 1922, moving to near the end of his life, and keep in mind he's lecturing his energy is ferocious. He's lecturing almost every night, from the age of 40 all the way down to his death in his mid-60s, lecturing almost every night, running around all over Europe and England and everywhere. Never went to the United States, however. But he's everywhere in Europe and all over the place lecturing. And then, so fast forwarding to near the end of his life, in 1922, the Goetheanum is burned down by the Nazis. There are speculations on who burnt it down, but it's pretty evident that it was the Nazis. They were after him. They did not like him. They did not like that he was not a nationalist. He was patriotic about Germany, but not a nationalist. He drew the line there. And the Nazis had no use for developed individuals. They wanted stormtroopers, basically clones, an army of clones, just like in Lucas's film Attack of the Clones. That's what they were looking for, not individuals who could think for themselves. Steiner teaches you to think for yourself. And so they burned down the Goetheanum. It had only been up and running for about 2 years. There had been a decade's worth of work involved in it, very carefully constructed, very beautiful. I think there's a picture of it here on, let's see, down here below on the Wikipedia page. Where is it? Yes, so here's the Goetheanum. And as you can see, it has Art Nouveau influences and German expressionist influences as well. So it's very much a product of its age, and it was built out of wood, and it looks organic because he had in mind Goethe's Urpflanze, the metaphysical plant, and he wanted to, and it's called the Goetheanum, so he wanted it to look like it grew out of the earth, almost like it's a plant. And it was built out of all kinds of wood, oak, maple, ash, birch, elm, and so forth, all these kinds of wood that have sacred mythological connotations. But alas, it was burned down, most likely by the Nazis, and then it was rebuilt out of concrete, and here it is as it stands today, rebuilt out of concrete. It's very aggressive looking. It almost challenges the viewer, try burning me down, you're going to get nowhere. There's a loss of beauty because of that, because it's built with reinforced concrete, but there it is. At least it's still there, and it contains one of his great sculptures within it here, the representative of mankind, which Steiner was a polymath. He was an architect, he was a sculptor, a painter, you name it. The guy's versatility is unbelievable. So here he has carved Christ in between Lucifer and Ahriman, Lucifer up above and Ahriman down below. Ahriman is the being that he has taken from Zoroastrian cosmology, who is associated with matter, with materialism, and with trying to bolster materialism and trying to convince the human being that matter is the only thing that matters, that spirituality does not matter. So to a certain extent, Ahriman has been very victorious in our civilization. Lucifer, on the other hand, is the being that is tempted toward overweening pride, like Lucifer in Milton's Paradise Lost. But Lucifer tempts man away from the material world and tries to trick him into believing that only the spiritual world matters. And this might be, he might have had India in mind here for the Luciferic tendencies, whereas the Christ being comes down in the center and balances both of those tendencies. Also, he says that the Archangel Michael descended into the Earth's etheric body in the year 1879 and will slowly transubstantiate our materialism into what Spengler calls a second religiousness and defeat Ahriman. And I do believe that Steiner is anthroposophy is part of what Steiner called what Spengler called the second religiousness, that he saw that would gradually come into our civilization and slowly transubstantiate its materialism, alongside the formation of Caesarism from out of the disintegration of democratic and republican values. So he's near the ending of his life, but his energy is not slowed down in the slightest. He's giving lectures constantly. He gives a famous lecture cycle on bees in 1923, which has become a classic in the field of beekeeping, and which very strongly influenced the contemporary artist Joseph Beuys, who has really defined all the rules of contemporary art. I've written about Beuys and also all the Dusseldorf artists, the famous ones, Odd Nedrum, Gerhard Richter, Anselm Kiefer, and so forth in my book, Art After Metaphysics, which is available on Amazon for those interested. Then in 1924, on New Year's Day, they lay the second foundation stone for the new Goetheanum, so that's laid, and he's writing his autobiography, and he's giving lectures on his magnum opus, which is my favorite work of his, Karmic Relationships, which is 8 volumes long, where he goes back through famous individuals in European history and tells you about their past lives. For example, he says that the reason Karl Marx hated the bourgeoisie was because in a previous lifetime, way back, centuries back, Marx was a landowner who had his land stolen from him, taken away from him by none other than the reincarnation of Engels. So Marx and Engels had a karmic relationship to work out, which is why they reincarnated together to dismantle capitalism and fight against the owners of the means of production, the bourgeois. But there's a karmic lesson there. And so he does this with all these famous individuals, talking about how Emerson is the reincarnation of the Roman historian Tacitus, whereas Hermann Grimm is the reincarnate who really liked and wanted to emulate Emerson's style. Hermann Grimm, and who was a friend of Steiner's, was the reincarnation of Pliny the Younger, who was the sort of pupil of Tacitus. They have reincarnated as Emerson and Hermann Grimm, and so forth. So he goes through all these famous individuals and shows in surprising ways, because he had a clairvoyant ability, to read what's called the Akashic Record, which is the world's cosmic memory. Everything that happens is ingrained in the Akashic Record somehow. It's the cosmic memory of the entire universe. And the individual, such as a medium with clairvoyant abilities, can tap into it and read the Akashic Record, which Steiner was able to do. And this may be why he was so accurate about the afterlife. He was talking about ideas about the afterlife that science did not start uncovering until Raymond Moody in the 1970s started chronicling near-death experiences and started chronicling the fact that most of the people, when they die and go to the other side, talk about having a life review, where they are shown panoramically images of the life that they have just lived, and all the pain that they have caused other individuals, they experience from the viewpoint of those individuals. And they are their own judge. There is a panel of elders there who judges, who arranges for this. And Steiner was talking about all of that long before anybody had ever heard anything about near-death experiences and life reviews. It's already there in Steiner. And indeed, you'll find all kinds of things, at least I have in my personal spiritual researches, talking to mediums and reading many, many accounts of individuals who undergo regressive hypnosis to remember not only their past lives, but lives between lives, such as in the books of Brian Weiss or Michael P. Newton or Robert Schwartz. Study those books. They're loaded with clear, lucid accounts of individuals under hypnosis who remember their life between lives. That world over there that Steiner talks about, that maps on very well, although Steiner is speaking in a mythological language that sometimes has to be deciphered and mapped onto the reality of what these clients of these hypnotists say is happening on the other side. And there's lots of correspondences, lots of matchups pretty firmly. So he's lecturing on karmic relationships all over Europe and writing his autobiography, and then he gets sick. No one is sure what the illness is, but it seems to have been some sort of a gastrointestinal illness that ate away at his energy. And pretty soon, after about September of 1924, he no longer has the energy to give lectures. He just gives out, and he's confined to his bed for 6 months. The last 6 months of his life, where then he proceeds to write letters. And those are collected in a volume called Anthroposophical Leading Thoughts. They are his final thoughts. He's reading letters to people, asking him questions, and then dictating them to a scribe who writes the replies. And then he dies, I think it's March 30th of 1925. And that's it. And so we are dealing with the legacy of Steiner. And so what I want to do in the class, what we'll do is go over some of his key texts. Here we will read Theosophy and How to Know Higher Worlds. We will also read Cosmic Memory and the Fifth Gospel, which is his narrative of the life of Christ and the mystery of Golgotha. I also want to look at anthroposophical medicine just to give an idea of some of his pragmatic applications. We may also have time in that lecture to cover some of the basics of biodynamic agriculture as well. And then we'll go over karmic relationships. We'll talk about a number of those. And his ideas about the dawning of the age of the Archangel Michael, which comes in from 1879 on, in which Michael is slaying the dragon of materialism, as it were. All right, so that's it. That's going to be our first class. I'm glad to have all of you here. And so we will proceed to discuss Rudolf Steiner. And then next week, we're going to read Theosophy. So that, I think, is the best introduction to Steiner because it outlines his model of the subtle body, what I talked about with the physical body, the etheric body, the astral body, the ego with its three components, sentient soul, intellectual soul, consciousness soul, and then the upper spiritual faculties of manas, buddhi, and atma.